Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Open Air presented by the Harvey B. Gantt Center in Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm your host, Dexter Wimberly, and I'm delighted to introduce you to today's guest. Mario Moore, a Detroit native, earned a BFA from the College for Creative Studies in 2009 and an MFA in painting from Yale School of Art in 2013. Drawing on history, politics, literature, and art, Moore weaves narratives about his surroundings and investigates the relationship between past and present in his work. He is a recent Kresge Arts Fellow and received the Princeton Howder Fellowship from 2018 to 2019. He's also held residencies at Duke University, the Joseph and Annie Albers Foundation, Fountainhead, and Knox College. Moore's work is held in the permanent collections of the Detroit Institute of Arts, Princeton University Art Museum, the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Mott Walsh Collection, Louisiana State University Museum of Art, California African American Museum, Flint Institute of Arts, and the Francis Lehman Loeb Art Center. His work has been widely exhibited, including at the Detroit Institute of Arts, the Lewis Center for Arts at Princeton University, the Smart Museum of Art in Chicago, Cranbrook Art Museum, David Klein Gallery in Detroit, Jeffrey Deitch Gallery in LA, Arthur Rogers in New Orleans, and the Cleveland Museum of Art. His exhibition, In Pursuit of Home, is on view at the Harvey B. Gantt Center through April 26, 2026. Please join me in welcoming Mario Moore to today's conversation.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here and glad to be talking to you, Dexter, always.
Yeah, man. Yeah. Well, your bio is a mouthful. I was like, yeah, it's a lot. You've done a lot, man, in the time that I've known you, which is like really exciting for me to always reflect on, because it has been, so long. I think we met, like almost like 14 years ago, something like
Yeah.
that. It's like quite a while. And so all of those things that I just read really kind of happened sort of in that arc of time. I mean, in many ways. So, I want to just ground today's conversation in a couple of things. Like one, as I mentioned, you have an exhibition on view at the Gantt Center. And so that's really fantastic. And that gives us a lot to talk about in terms of that particular show. But I also think that people are always curious to kind of understand like what your life is like being an artist in Detroit. I mean, you were from there, but then you left Detroit for a while and then you went back. Maybe you can talk us through a little bit of that, like, being an established artist in Detroit, leaving to be in sort of New York, I believe, for a while, other places, and then coming back to Detroit. Give us a little bit of background on that.
Yeah, yeah. I think a lot of creative people are really curious about Detroit, especially when I was living on the East Coast to try to just understand it and what that was like. Detroit is a beautiful place. It's a city that beams with creativity, and I feel like it's a city for artists. Right, of course, real estate and all that is changing, so prices are increasing, but it's still really affordable. I grew up in the 90s in a time where there was a lot of artists and elders of mine that were practicing and having shows. And there were black galleries, there were white galleries, and there were galleries that had an integration of artists showing together. And this kind of sounds weird, right, in the 90s, but at the same time, Detroit is a really, really black city via the population. So a lot of the suburban white gallery spaces, you usually didn't find a lot of black artists in those spaces. But at the same time, there was so much innovation and a level of ingenuity in the way that people made things that I was really interested in. My mother being an artist, and I look at Detroit in a certain period as older artists would talk about New York in the 70s. How they could rent like a loft and they would, or they bought a loft for like $300 or $400, something crazy like that, right? Before I went to grad school at Yale, so that was 2011. We would put together shows in like warehouses. Me and a couple friends would get together. We put together shows, and we would pack out the show. We would, everybody would come, everybody would show up, and everybody would have a good time. And there was just a kind of freedom in thinking about the ways in which you wanted your work to be seen, and also what you wanted to talk about, and the ability to do that. There weren't a lot of restrictions. There were community galleries. There was also a really long history of artists practicing in Detroit. One of the first, I guess, internationally recognized black artists, Robert Seldon Duncanson, was in Detroit. And Huey Lee Smith, another incredible artist that I really, really love, was based in Detroit, and also in Ohio as well, but spent a lot of time in Detroit. So we had this incredible history, and for me, I was always connected to a lot of people. So I felt like after a while, as I was having these shows with my community, and I was also working a job because I just graduated from undergrad, and that job was working for the film industry. There was a lot of huge Hollywood films that were being shot in Michigan at that time because of this huge incentive that they had, tax incentive. And I realized that I wasn't able to make my art because all my time was going into this job. So I started to ask myself, what can I do to allow myself to be a practicing artist all the time? And I was like, okay, grad school is the answer. So I wanted to go to Yale, and that's all because of my mentor Richard Lewis.
Thank you for that. I'm thinking about the past decade and a half, 10, 15 years of the art world, and you've kind of come up at a time where the art world has gone through yet another one of its like major shifts in terms of the economy of the art world, sort of where people's priorities are around issues of culture and race and identity. That work comes up constantly.
All the
But
time.
something about your work has remained quite focused since the first time I met you. And so two parts to this question. One is, what are the changes you've seen as an artist in the past 10, 15 years, significant changes? And this is, and this answer really is kind of geared toward artists that might be listening to this conversation and are sort of trying to navigate the art world.
Yeah.
And then the other part of the question is what's given you the strength to stay the course?
So, there's been a lot of shifts. One, as an artist who is interested in a level of realism And I think realism and photorealism gets confused a lot, or realism as a concept gets confused a lot with being able to portray something that looks real. But for me, the impetus of that was looked down upon when I came into grad school. The idea of the figure was something that was, no, I want you to move all the way away from that and consider some other options. And granted, again, growing up in Detroit, I had the spectrum of people making around me, abstractionists, minimalists. I mean, people were doing all kinds of things. So I've always appreciated that. But it was something about realism that for me opened the gates to the public in a really, really, really broad way. And I was really adamant about that. So that shifted in the last 15 years where there's a hyper awareness to figuration, and now we're seeing a small switch, right? There's a switch back to a certain kind of abstraction, but not necessarily like it's still playing in the figurative world, but it's more of an abstraction. And I think that shift is one to do with technology, but also to do with the oversaturation of bad figurative art. I mean, there's been a lot of it. There's that. And then it's just the gallery world, that shift in how we're seeing the the entire art system and our ecosystem having to rethink and reframe itself as it should, right? I think for the most part there's been these organizations and these galleries that have a certain kind of control, and that control says who's going to succeed and who's not, right? Social media has changed a lot of that. But I also think the number of art fairs, the expense for all of that, the expense for galleries, all of that is being taken into account now. And for me, as I'm talking to any other artist that's listening right now, and especially those who are just kind of getting into this space, is a lot of my level of kind of continuing in wherever my art takes me and not denying that or not changing because I'm trying to chase whatever's popular in the art world, comes from the city of Detroit. I think there is a level of kind of tenacity and go get it aspect when it comes to Detroit, and hustle, right? When I got out of grad school, when I got out of Yale, and then I think a lot of people think like this when they go into these big schools or Ivy League schools or the big school that you can come out of and you expect to get snatched up by a gallery, whether that's RISD, Yale, Columbia.
Sure.
Um, the idea is you're going to get snatched up by a blue collar gallery right away and have an incredible successful show and sell out and become this big art star, when that's not the reality. It might be one or two of you maybe out of your class that gets that opportunity. I knew that I would have to work when I got out of grad school. I already had that in my mind, and I was approaching galleries. I was doing what I always did. I was going to talk to people about my work, and I always made sure that I just didn't rely on the gallery system, because the gallery system is essentially, they have a stable of artists. It's almost like the music industry.
Hmm.
They have attention that they have to shift between who's going to have a show and who's making them the most money. So that's the things that they have to think about. I have to think about, one, first, my practice and what kind of work I'm making and why I'm making it. And then two, how to sustain myself. And for me, that's always been making sure that I got a project over here, I got a project over here, I got a job over there, but it's always been multiple streams. And I think that's the way that a lot of artists are going to be successful moving forward. The other thing, and this is something that Kerry James Marshall said at one of his lectures, was that no matter what your situation is, economically, city wise, wherever you live, you have to prioritize making art. It's so easy, once you get out of these grad schools or any space, even if you're a self-taught artist, to put your work on the back end and allow your job to kind of take up the most of your time. Meaning your job and your career is your art, so you have to prioritize that. That's not saying you don't get off work, but when you get off work, what are you doing? You need to make sure you're getting to whatever piece you're supposed to be working on, and that's always stayed at the front of my mind.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks you for sharing that because I think it's important to look at like what it actually means to be an artist today, like a working artist today. Yesterday I had a conversation with an incredibly established artist who works with, as you mentioned, like one of these blue chip galleries. And the fact is that artist is still dealing with a lot of the challenges that you would think would have fallen away by the time you reach a certain level, right? They're still dealing with, whether the gallery is prioritizing them. They're still dealing with how many art fairs they can actually have the capacity to participate in. Like all of those things that if you're in your 20s or 30s, you're like, wow, man, this art world is crazy and I got to deal with all this stuff. I can't wait until I don't have to deal with it anymore. Well, I got news for you. you know
Yeah,
it's a lifetime of negotiating all of these different variables as it relates to your career. You mentioned Kerry James Marshall. I'm sure there are several other artists that have been incredibly influential in your life and in your career, and you mentioned your mother's an artist, so talk a little bit about that, like growing up in a house with artists, in an artistic household, and how that spilled over into your own practice and even into the work that you've become known for.
yeah. I grew up with art on the walls, everywhere. It was amazing, and my mom had a lot of art books, so I felt like I always had access to the world in front of me, right? I was able to look back and see what kind of art was made in the past, and of course we would go to museums a lot, and I'm really thankful to my mom for exposing me to that as a child. And she would have a lot of friends over, weird friends and creative people, and they would have conversations. They would, talk about what it meant to be an artist. They would talk about what kind of work they were making, and we would go to people's studios when I was like 4 years old, 5 years old. So I'm able to see people making whatever is in their head, and they're creating that thing. And for me, I was like, oh, there's nothing else that I want to do. That to me seems the most genuine thing that I, as an individual, in what my body wants to do, what my hands want to do, wanted to pursue. And I think a lot of it for me is recognizing now as an adult the access to individuals I had as a child. And I'll give you an example of that. My dad, now I tell this story, and I told this story before, but my dad's not an artist, but he always told me, he was like, you need to learn how to paint in oils. And I was interested in drawing in high school, and that, like everybody else, I would draw cartoons and things like that. But my mom had a friend, and I knew him since I was a kid. He was Richard. His name was Richard Lewis, and he was an incredible painter. And he's always been an incredible painter to me. But he moved. He lived on the East Coast, and as a kid, I'm playing with other kids and video games, but I'm also doing art and all that kind of stuff. I'm not really paying attention to who these people are, right? So he moves back to Detroit. And I talked to my mom because my dad keeps telling me I need to learn how to paint in oils. And I say, do you think Richard would teach me how to paint with oils? And she was like, yeah, what? Just ask him. So here I am, 10th grader, the summer between 10th and 11th grade, whatever age that is. What is that, 15?
Yeah.
A 15-year-old, and I'm trying to get private lessons from this artist that I've known all my life. And he says yes. And I'm like, sweet. So I go over to Richard's house and I'm learning how to paint in oils. And I see a degree on the wall that says he went to Yale. I didn't know that, or I wasn't paying attention.
Sure.
And then I realized he did a Studio Museum of Harlem residency. I'm not paying attention to that either. But now, as an adult, I realize that amount of access to be able to see somebody from where I'm from able to take that journey and be successful and end up in the New York Times. And granted, a lot of people nationwide or worldwide don't know Richard Lewis, but they should. He for me was the kind of world opener, you
Mm.
know, and that access to think about being a professional artist in the kind of historical sense. And he was always a practitioner. He was in the studio all the time, and he's a very, very slow painter. And when I say he's a slow painter, he will work on paintings for years. But it was something that I think, I've talked to a lot of other elder, Detroit artists, and honestly, artists from the Midwest and artists from the South. Like, they're really in the studio every day making, and it was a difference when I got into these studios and saw some how other artists work. It's kind of like, oh, they'll work and then they're, maybe out for a month partying, and then they go back in there and work again, out for, and I think that tenacity, kind of going back to that, was the level that I was brought up on, and what I should expect for myself as an artist. And Richard and my mom and Shirley Woodson Reed, Gilda Snowden, all of these artists kind of laid that foundation of a practice for me.
Yeah, and there's so much of it shows. I mean, the fact is, artists come in all shapes and sizes, and their approach to making their work varies greatly. And I'll be the first to say that, there's some artists whose work seems quite fast and sort of effortless, not in a negative sense, but I think there are different ways to arrive at what one would consider, for the sake of our conversation, a completed painting, right?
Yep.
However, I think that there's something pretty evident when you're standing in front of a work and you can see the energy and the focus and the determination and the commitment that the artist had to rendering an image, or a land, whether that's a portrait or landscape or whatever it is. And I think that that does matter. And I think it's like any other thing. You're exercising an intellectual muscle as well as a physical one in approaching work in that way. I mean, you and I joked at the Gantt Center looking at one of the paintings there that we'll get to in the slideshow. I was like, man, I'm sure you did not enjoy painting all of that grass, right? Um, and I was only like half joking because in a way, there's no way around it. If you really want to achieve that, it's got to be done. Now, whether that's you working alone or you working with an assistant, or it doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, someone's got to paint that grass, right?
Somebody's got to do it.
Um, Somebody's got to do it, and it's also important to have the commitment to having it done and not taking a shortcut. And
Yep.
it's real, man. I mean, I think this past decade, even given the success that a lot of young artists have had, we know that some of that success has come with great sacrifice of their creative process. Always chasing deadlines is not something that I think, for a lot of artists, I don't think that's something that is necessarily healthy. I mean, some
Yeah.
people are fine with that, but I
Yeah.
think if you're always making a painting that has to leave your studio before it's even dry, and you're always doing that, there's something, maybe there's something that you're missing out on, even as the artist, to spend time with your own work.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's incredibly important, in this in the art world we're in right now. right? With the pace and everything you just said, you really don't have time to reflect on what you just made. You know, there's artists who talk about the 60s and 70s, like they would say they might have a solo show and then they would have another solo show 5 or 10 years later, because they have to build that breath and think about whatever the thought process is in the studio. And when I talk about the kind of labor and the facility and economy of making, I'm not just talking about the realism when it comes to myself and what I make. One artist who was really a pillar of the Detroit art community, her name was Gilda Snowden, and she
Mm,
was like the known person. You would go to her for advice or talk to her about colleges and art school and just this idea of what it means to be an artist. She passed away like right after I got a grad, like probably around 2015, somewhere around that time. But an artist I know, Kevin Beasley, who went to CCS with me and went to Yale, he talked about Gilda Snowden, and he talked about how he recognized being an artist, going into her studio was a serious job because her studio was filled with work, and she was making work every day, and she was an abstractionist. She would make these like kind of these paintings she called tornado paintings, and these kind of silhouetted self-portraits and chair paintings, and I mean these really really amazing works. Um, and I think it's just one of those things where you see kind of the idea of what it means to practice and make, which is important, I think, to any artist, right? Versus just the imagined concept of what social media or the
mm.
gallery world says it means to be an artist, or says what it looks like to be an artist. I think those are two different things.
Yeah, and truth be told, I mean, I think a lot of people, and this is not just in the art world, it probably spills over into other disciplines, but you can admire someone's career because you're looking at it from a distance.
Yeah, yeah,
But then, like, do you want to walk in their shoes? Oftentimes, we don't even know what that journey's like. And so I think of the painters that I sort of, admired at the beginning of my curatorial journey and sort of these iconic, some are still with us, some aren't. People like Jack Whitten, et cetera. And I'm just like, wow, like, look at this work. It's like, and I could say all sorts of superlatives, but the fact is, there was a day he was probably making that work in a place with not hot, no hot water and no heat, right?
exactly.
His words, not mine, right? And I'm
Yeah,
like, yeah, I don't know how many artists want to be in that situation, even to make that painting, today. Like it's like one of those things where you have to understand that a lot of, and it wasn't like all bad for artists. Like it's not like even to paint the picture. Some artists, you know, their lives were fine and they were making great work. You didn't have to suffer to make great work. That's not my point. My point is, I think that for a lot of artists of your generation and perhaps younger, they are idolizing these iconic artists, but they don't necessarily want to go through the process
right, right, right,
artists
right.
went through. And that's I guess that's just normal, we're switching gears again a bit, and let's talk a little bit about the exhibition at the Gantt Center. So the title of the show is In Pursuit of Home, and I would love for you to talk about like why that subject mattered to you. Like, what brought you to home and the concept of home ownership as a subject matter for an exhibition.
Yeah, I think it was. I think it's been a journey of where I am right now in my life, but also a lot of travel, living in a lot of different cities, living in other countries, and looking for a base, right? A place where I feel comfortable and I can go about and get on a plane and go anywhere I want. I think that's really what it was, is where can I create a space to build a legacy, or where can I have a feeling of some kind of safety, and then that becomes a question, like, what does that look like? And at the same time, I was in the process of thinking about buying a home. So that led me to started to do research about just home ownership in general, and then digging into the research of Black home ownership and land ownership. And as you kind of when you dive into that, you get really deep, and then you start to understand that a lot of the wealth and the generational wealth that's missing from the Black communities as a whole, right? Not, I'm not talking about everybody, but as a whole, is because of certain kind of things where properties were stolen via all these kind of systems, whether it was taxes, whether it was the false promise of 40 acres and a mule, or whether it was you got 40 acres and a mule, Reconstruction happened, and then slave owners were forgave and they were given back their properties. So now you're working as a sharecropper, and you're pretty much enslaved because you get paid, but you have all this debt because you're buying machines and cows and renting. So now you owe the whatever the farm lead is called, or you can say the previous slave owner. And then you have the Great Migration, where families are moving up north. And I talk about this often, that you know my grandparents' generation and great grandparents' generation was a generation that was able to get a great job in one of these cities up north, and then they were able to buy these properties. But very quickly, a generation or later, all those properties were almost, if not most, were lost or gone or sold, right? And the question becomes why. So as I started to ask that question, I started to see the systems, and I wanted to create a show where I'm talking about this idea of home safety, land comfort, in a time where we are being barraged with federal agents who are pulling people out of their houses, right? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, there's so much there, and I was immediately excited about this subject as a foundation for a show, because I think that the times that we're living in right now is really making it clear to people that there's a thin line between what you own and and what can be taken away from you, and how quickly that line can be crossed just by rules changing. And I want to spend some more time on this, but I also want to start looking at some of your work. So we'll get an image up on the screen, but I will follow up with a question. When you think about these spaces that you're painting, not just for this exhibition, but for other paintings you've made that deal with domestic spaces, what's sort of driving your decisions? So let's talk about this particular work on screen now, and you can talk a little bit about composition and your decision making about where to place a figure um, within the framework of the painting, and you can even talk more broadly than that.
Yeah, I think a lot of paintings sometimes start as a question and a challenge. One of the rules that you learn as a kid doing art: never place something in the middle of a painting. It's like a no. So for me, it's like, I'm going to do that, and I'm going to make it make sense by altering what's on the side, and paying as much attention to that. But I'm also, at the same time that I'm thinking about this broad story of home, and I'll get into what this painting is about. I'm also very much thinking about art history. Like, Barkley Hendricks has been an incredible influence on me as well. So I'm thinking about those paintings, those figures, especially in that 70s kind of dress, right? In the middle of a very minimal space. But how do I put that in the context of a room and a space where I'm trying to make you feel like there's an actual space to enter? So these are the conversations that I'm having internally in the studio, especially as I'm making this work. But this work really is about the founding of Michigan, and it as a kind of fur trade uh, Parisian colony, right? So a lot of what's talked about when you talk about the founding of Detroit, which was founded in 1701, is that the Dutch were there, the French were there, some of the English not by that time, but it was for the fur trade. It was a frontier space, and the Europeans were there, and they were mainly trading with Native Americans. And the natives would, Native men would do the hunting, and the Native women would do the trimming of the fur, and then they would trade. What gets left out of the conversation were black enslaved people that were also in Michigan, and they were transporting the furs. So the two paintings that are on the side of the main figure in the middle are actual lithographs from that time period of what it was like in the Midwest, not just Michigan, but in the Midwest, of the kind of frontier space. So I've changed those images. At first, I turned them into paintings because lithographs are black and white. So I added color, and then I added a few black figures into those paintings to kind of put them back into the narrative that they were a part of historically. And at the same time, the figure in the painting, the woman, is a representation of black women, and one of the first documented enslaved people in Detroit and in Michigan was a black woman. And there's the sensibility that, or a history that a lot of the enslaved women, whether they were Native or black, did not have possession of their own bodies, right? Meaning that they can be used, they could be abused in different ways. So I wanted a really powerful image of this black woman at the center of this painting that kind of has on the side entering into the space her presence as a part of the history, but also acknowledging the kind of fur trade history along with style, right? Black Detroiters wear a lot of furs, and the model actually brought, I think, her grandmother's fur or her mother's fur. It's this known thing that we can kind of get into later,
Mm,
but yeah, it's always pulling that past and present together, and to not be ashamed to do it, you know?
that's great, man. Let's go to the next image. In terms of, and this brings us back to this whole idea of home ownership. Maybe you can give a little bit of background on this image, and then I'll follow up my question.
Yeah, I was doing some research through the Detroit Library archives, pretty much online, and they had this incredible image of a mortgage burning, and it was a mortgage burning in like 1880 something, and it was for a women's social club. It was the Phyllis Wheatley Social Club or something. That was the name of it. And I've never seen anything like that. It was this entire group of women, and they were getting ready to burn this mortgage, and all the hands were attached by a string to connect to the mortgage. And after doing some research, I mean, it's still something that happens today, mainly in churches and groups, not so much individually, or as far as where my reach has been and the things that I researched. It's not something that's really practiced today. But I was like, man, this must be amazing to actually burn the mortgage after your last payment, where you actually own the home, right? Even though you have to pay taxes. but you've paid off that last mortgage. You have to pay no lending company anymore. So now it's yours. So the idea is that this paper is a symbol of the connection you had to make these payments, but now it's yours. So people gather and they burn this mortgage. It's usually above some kind of metal bucket. And I wanted to create a painting that was an homage to that historical image.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about like the symbolism of home ownership, but then like getting down to like more of the practical aspects of it. And you just touched on it a little bit when you mentioned, you can own the home, but then like lose it from taxes. And and you and I talked about that a lot. I think there's a lot of young people, for example, who don't really necessarily understand that even if you pay off your mortgage, you still have all of these responsibilities that relate to home ownership, and that disparity between those who know this and those who don't know this, and the difference between being educated on these different aspects of home ownership can make a huge difference. And I think so many folks also looked at Detroit's history in the past, say 20 years, and all of the hype and propaganda around like cheap houses and all of that stuff. Being there through all of that, can you just kind of give a little bit of like background, like what your experience was like in like the early 2000s or mid aughts, where there was all of this like news swirling around about Detroit's future? And I felt like I couldn't look at the New York Times once without there being a story about Detroit.
Yeah, I remember me and my friends at NCCS going downtown because the Super Bowl was in Detroit, and I think this was 2000. I think that was 2008.
Okay.
Uh, and what was the reason why I bring this up is because downtown Detroit, when I was growing up, was basically clubs. It was hair salon, a few hair salons, and then a lot of boarded up spaces and liquor stores. There were some apartments and some things like that. My Gma actually lived downtown for a while, so there was things going on, but not so much. People really didn't go downtown unless you were going for those things. So when the Super Bowl came, what they did was they boarded up all the abandoned spaces and they put vinyl on all the windows and acted like there were stores inside of them. So what you had, I think, when what you had was a lot of investors that came for the Super Bowl and saw the potential. And that's really when the change and the money started happening after the Super Bowl in Detroit. So you had this huge turnover where a lot of reinvestment was happening back in downtown Detroit, right? At the same time, Detroit at one point was the largest city with the most black homeowners, which I think is really, really significant, right? And I don't think that's still the case, but a lot of that is changing. And also the investment that's happening in Detroit is mainly downtown and midtown, while the rest of the city doesn't get the same financial attention. So all the hoopla that was happening about the financial crisis, a lot of that is real, but at the same time, again, growing up in the art community here, like, it's always been incredible, it's always been beautiful, it's always been things where if you wanted to have a good time, if you wanted to see some incredible art, if you wanted to see some beautiful architecture, if you wanted to meet some really, really dope people, it was here in Detroit. So while the news was highlighting the kind of terror, the crime, and the decimation, it was like, at the same time I'm looking at the news and I was like, yo, I was just in a coffee shop over here, and I was just at an art gallery over here, and then I was just in this artist studio over here, and it wasn't matching what was actually happening. And I think that has a lot to do with the people of Detroit. Um, some of the landscape, but mainly the people. Now, the changes that are happening is mainly the landscape and some of the people. so so I think there's great things happening, but again, the news love to highlight the ruin porn, and Detroiters will tell you that they hate it when the news would come on or somebody would come and they would just take photos of all the abandoned plants, and they wouldn't go into the historic neighborhoods where Barry Gorey's mansion would be, or you know what I mean, like some of these gorgeous areas that we know of Detroit, or the Midtown area that has always been the same even till now, with all the museums, the libraries, the universities, the colleges. Um, so yeah, the media pays attention to the story that it wants, right?
Right. Absolutely true.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. Let's go to the next image. My first time visiting Detroit was 1995. So I'm happy that I was able to visit in such a long time ago because it's given me a different perspective than someone who maybe, went for the first time in like, I don't know, 2020. It's a very different uh, time for the city, of course, of course. So this is a very interesting painting that I'm sure when people see it, it evokes all sorts of questions. So if you could just,
Absolutely.
in the interest of time, give a really short background on this painting.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I was doing these garland paintings, and this one in particular, titled "Watermelon Man," is essentially about the history of antebellum black men that used the watermelon to as one of the first economic means to buy houses and property, and how the image and the icon of the watermelon, because of the success of these entrepreneurs, was turned against black people through propaganda. And it's one of the reasons why a lot of black people don't want to be associated with watermelons, right? That's where you get the Aunt Jemimas and the Sambos and all of these images. So it's really about, what does it mean to take that fruit back that actually came with us in the transatlantic slave trade, and a fruit that gave us economic power. So that's really what the painting's about.
Yeah, and I love how it kind of connects to this, painting's history, like going all the way back to a time when paintings symbolized more than just making someone's portrait, but was almost like, symbolic of, God, and sort of like had religious connotations, and I really love the attention to detail that you've given to the fruit in this painting. And I also laugh when you talk about why there are no seeds in a watermelon, which I always thought was funny because I'm like, well, you could have just, right, you if you wanted to, but
Right, right.
you're so committed to realism.
I could have, and and I think that's the other thing too, right? Like, I think a lot of people, when they look at my work, right, they see a level of realism. I think it's different digitally versus what it's like to see it in person, even though you still have that perception. But at the same time, there's a level of invention that's happening in these paintings. I don't have all the photographs, right, set up where I took a picture and now I'm just painting a one-to-one relationship,
Right, right.
right? There's level of additions and adding that are coming from my mind. So I could have just did that. I just wasn't thinking about it when it came to the scene.
Let's go to the next painting. We have two more as well. So this work so striking because, well, number one, it being a self portrait, I think is always interesting because for me, I'm always excited to hear how an artist decides like how they're going to paint themselves.
Mhm.
Because there's a way of it being, as you mentioned, kind of like one to one. There's a way of it being like honest and true, and then there's a way of it being sort of like a version of how you want other people to see you.
Absolutely. Yes.
How
Yes.
do you and so just as a little bit of a turn on the question, rather than talking about what we're seeing in the image, talk just for a moment, talk about what it's like to paint yourself, like your own, like a
Mhm.
self-portrait. Like what's that process like, and what are some of the challenges?
Well, I think a self portrait can go two different ways, right? Because you have to really look at yourself. And I think when you do that, and what I mean by look at yourself, like when I'm drawing somebody or I'm painting somebody, um, I'm looking at all the nuances of them, all the details, all the cracks, all the nooks and crannies, all the beauty about them. So you're getting all of that. And when you look at yourself, you really have to do that, right? Like, but you can also put on a shield. You can do both of those things. And I like to think about self portraits in the same way as Rembrandt did. They were these documents of time, but they were also moments where he was feeling good about himself, right? So you have those paintings, and then you have those paintings where it's like, man, you really were going through it, so for me, when thinking about this particular work and how I wanted to be represented, I I really was thinking about what kind of picture I wanted to put together. And that was really a painting about light. Like if you can, pay attention to the floor, when you see this painting in person, the floor is painted in one layer. So there's a lot of light that passes through whatever I put down and reflects on the back of the white canvas. So there's no kind of opaque paint on top versus the pants, and there's a kind of subtle light that shifts up the body. And that's really what I wanted to pay attention to for this painting. But the painting is very much one of these pieces that, I mean, like all work, but more so this one, that needs to be finished by people that's viewing it, because everybody asks me what does he have in his hand, and I'm like, I don't know, you tell me. Right, because
Well, judging from the expression on your face, it's not something great.
right. I think everybody has opened the door and got some kind of bill or letter or whatever it was that they were not excited about, But yeah, it's I think when it comes to self reflection in self portraits, it doesn't matter what you do. There's a certain level of honesty that has to be there for it to be
Mm,
you. Even if you put on a shield, there's a certain level of honesty you have to approach
yeah.
yourself with. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Great piece, great piece. So let's go to the final image, and we have about 10 minutes. So this kind
Yeah.
of time is working out here. So let's talk about this work. When this is the painting that I mentioned, all of that grass, and
Yeah.
I'm sure you regretted making this in the backyard painting, but well, let's get the title and what are we seeing here?
So the work, Burial of a Tax Shark, which is a term that was used for tax buyers in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. And tax buyers were basically predatory buyers at the time that were using the system to steal properties from black homeowners. And the painting is basically about burying the system. So it's really hard to see what's on the screen. It's kind of one of those things where you have to see the painting in person. But it's me and a group of friends burying this tax shark who is hidden behind the figure, the female figure in front, Tiff, with the hat on top. And the papers he's holding is a tax sale and a redlining map that was sent out by one insurance company, and it was the same insurance company that sent out the redlining map through all the United States, for depicting basically areas of interest and areas of where not to sell to black people and where black people should be confined in, when it came to communities and housing. So yeah, it's a lot that's happening in this painting, but yeah, let's talk more about it.
Well, I mean, I definitely think that it sparks so many thoughts in my mind. I think there are a lot of people that don't really realize just how systemic and aggressive the effort was to remove Black people from their homes. I think there is a tendency for people, including some Black people actually, to
Yeah.
assume that this was sort of, every once in a while random thing that happened, but didn't happen as part of our overall process. And the evidence shows otherwise.
Yeah, and
Uh,
I
yeah.
think what it was like as I was doing, my research, and I was really focused on this one book, called The Black Tax. And it really kind of explains the monetary system that was used to defund, and also remove properties out of black hands and black communities. I mean, when you really talk about it, you talk about home ownership and 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 taxes you pay in your home. That pays for a lot of the systems that function within the city or cities, the public school system. It funds basically how the city is funded, how roads are fixed, how trash is picked up, how electricity in the cities are handled, how streets are cleaned, all of these things. So when you have systems in place that's pulling that, then you get the events like or the time in history like the Bronx in the 70s, right? You
Yeah.
you get these spaces that become defunded, and you get education systems that start to bear illiterate kids because they don't have the right books, they don't have the funding for this, or the teachers that are needed, or the proper books that are needed. So it just starts to explain a lot. But I think
Yeah.
what happens without looking into these processes, a lot of people are like, oh, like just didn't care about their communities, or they just like let their house kind of deteriorate, or they just left or abandoned and moved, right? Like all of these things that are in play are part of the system that we lived in, and that we live in still, in a
Yeah.
way. So,
Yeah. And in Brooklyn, when I was a teenager, there were still people that were knocking on people's doors and trying to hand them like cash for their house, the house that they had spent the past 30 years paying for, finally don't have a mortgage on top of their head, and someone's offering them a significantly lower lump sum for their house.
yeah,
And if and if you're still struggling financially, that looks appealing, not thinking about the big picture, like what that means in terms of your family's legacy and history. So this is the final image. We're down to the final 5 minutes. So I want to, you mentioned 40 acres and a mule as a concept that we all kind of have heard of,
yeah,
in history. And it was a promise that was not fulfilled. And that makes me think of, our now like mutual, friend associate Spike Lee, who named his film company 40 Acres and a Mule. And the reason I bring up Spike is because it connects to a project that you have on your own, independent, has nothing to do with Spike Lee, but a project that you're working on in Detroit, around Malcolm X. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that, and then I'll explain why I brought up Spike Lee.
yeah. So I here in Detroit they had a large amount of Afrocentric schools. So I went to Malcolm X Academy from was that first grade to eighth grade before going to high school. But recently, a couple years ago, I just started to think about all the monuments because there was this big discussion about monuments. I mean, there still is now. We have a lot of Confederate statues that are being reinstalled from the ones that were taken down, which is crazy, but it's happening. And I started to ask myself, I was like, is there a public outdoor monument or sculpture dedicated to Malcolm X? And there is not one. And that to me it made sense, but at the same time, I was like, not really, right? He was assassinated in the 60s. And then we had the Malcolm X movie that came out in the 90s, and this huge explosion of like Malcolm mania. I would imagine that something would have occurred then. But no, there doesn't exist one. So that made me want to be the one to put something together to create a outdoor public Malcolm X sculpture for the city of Detroit, which would be the first in the U.S. And I'm actively pursuing that. So yeah, I'm really excited. I have a maquette. The sculpture is going to be 9 feet. It will be in a neighborhood of Detroit where Malcolm started his first ministry right after he got out of prison and moved in with his brother. He lived in Inkster and then he lived in Detroit for a time, and he became Minister Malcolm in Detroit. And of course, everybody knows a lot about his nickname, Detroit Red, that he got in Boston. But yeah, I'm heavily pursuing this, and I'm excited. It's been a challenge, but I'm working on it.
Well, it's very significant, and the reason I brought up Spike is because the maquettes you mentioned, you had an edition, bronze edition of the statue, and Spike Lee supported the project by being the person to purchase the first one out of the edition. So I encourage anyone listening here who is interested in a piece of history to get in touch with Mario if you want to, learn more about that. That'd be great. And of course, I want to learn more about the challenges that you're facing regarding making the project come to completion. Obviously we can talk about that offline here. And yeah, I really just have enjoyed talking to you, Mario, as always. This hour went by incredibly fast, as I knew
Wait,
it would.
so
Yeah, yeah. And I just want to reiterate to everyone, if you're in and around Charlotte, please go see Mario's exhibition. It's on view until April 26th. Follow him on Instagram, DM him, show your support. And yeah, I'm going to say my final words, Mario, before we go. Is there anything you'd like to say?
No, I want to thank you, Dexter, for this conversation, and I just encourage everybody who's on this live now to kind of just look into the history of taxes and home ownership when it comes to the Black community. I think it will, a lot of us know, right? But I think to see the record is really revealing.
Yeah, very, very true. Thank you so much, Mario. The Gantt Center's goal is always to provide programs that inform and inspire. The support of viewers like you allows the Gantt Center to expand its reach and further develop programs like today's Open Air. Lend your support to the Gantt Center by visiting ganttcenter.org/donate. Also, be sure to like and subscribe to this channel for future programs and other video content updates. We thank you all for joining us for another great conversation, and we look forward to next month's Open Air. Have a great and safe evening. Good night.